Northern Iraq, southern Mexico, southeastern Turkey, cultures that never touched each other, separated by an ocean in one direction and 8,000 years in the other. And in the ruins each of them left behind, somebody carved the same object into stone, a rounded container with a rigid bar across the top. Archaeology has explanations for this, and the explanations keep changing. Today, we're looking at the shape that shouldn't be there 3 times. If you've spent any time in this corner of the internet, you already know the claim. That shape is supposed to be everywhere. Sumerian palace reliefs, olmec stone monuments in Mexico, carvings in New Zealand, usually held by a figure who seems to matter, usually at chest height, and always presented as evidence that somebody was moving between these cultures long before anyone thinks they could have been. I spent about 3 weeks on this one, working through excavation reports and museum catalog entries instead of other people's videos, and I'll be honest with you up front. Some of those examples collapse the moment you check the source. Not all of them, but enough that I nearly dropped the topic entirely. A few of them hold though. And when I followed the ones that hold, I ended up somewhere I wasn't expecting, because the interesting answer isn't that someone carried this idea across the world. It's that they might not have had to. If you've been on this channel before, you already know the hill. Göbekli Tepe, southeastern Turkey. 11,000 years old, raised by hunter-gatherers with no metal and no farming behind them, buried under the dirt until Klaus Schmidt started digging in the mid-90s. I've made a whole video about why it shouldn't exist, and I'm not going to walk that ground twice. I want one pillar out of it, and one detail on that pillar I went straight past the first time. Enclosure D. The stone catalogued as Pillar 43. Most people call it the vulture stone because of the great bird spreading its wings across the middle of it, with a scorpion below and a fox tucked in among the figures. That's the part everyone photographs, and it's the part I described to you before. Above all of it, along the very top edge, runs a narrow register I never mentioned. 3 shapes sitting in a row. Each one has a rounded top and a flat base, with what reads as a solid handle spanning it. Now I have to slow down, because this is where most videos stop being careful. The mainstream reading is not that they're bags. Several archaeologists have argued the shapes represent the enclosures themselves, seen from the side. Others read them as sections of the horizon, with the animals underneath acting as markers. There are people who think the row is ornamental and means nothing at all. Every one of those is defensible. None of them requires a mystery, and it's probably one of them. What keeps pulling me back is that the proportions are oddly specific. The handle isn't drawn as a rope or a loose loop. It's rendered as a solid bar spanning a rounded body, and all 3 are close to identical, which suggests the carver had a fixed object in mind rather than a general idea. Whether that object was a container, a building, or a piece of sky, somebody 11,000 years ago decided the shape was worth cutting 3 times into the most visible register of the stone. Hold on to that, we're going to need it in about 3 minutes. Now jump forward 8,000 years. Northern Iraq, the city of Nimrud, sometime around 865 BCE. The palace of Ashurnasirpal II is being lined with carved stone panels, and among the figures on those panels is a type that appears again and again. They're winged and human-bodied, and some of them have the head of a bird. Assyriologists call them apkallu. Almost every one of them is carrying something. In one hand, there's a cone, and in the other, a container with a rigid handle across the top. You can go and stand in front of these. There are apkallu panels in the British Museum, in the Met, in Berlin. And when you're a meter away from one, the resemblance to Pillar 43 is genuinely hard to shake off. Except this is where the mystery dissolves. And I think it matters that I say so plainly. We know exactly what the Assyrians were holding because they wrote it down. The container is called a bandadu, and the cone is a mulalu. Cuneiform ritual texts describe the ceremony in detail. The apkallu dips the cone into liquid held in the bucket and sprinkles it over a person, a doorway, or a building. It's a purification rite. There's no ambiguity here and no gap in the record for something else to live in. So the Assyrian half of this pattern is solved completely. And I'd rather hand you that than pretend otherwise. Because any version of this story that leaves it out is doing something dishonest. Solving it, though, left me stuck on a question I hadn't planned for. If the Assyrian object is a ritual bucket, and the Göbekli Tepe shape predates it by 8,000 years, then the resemblance can't be inheritance. Nobody passed this down. The Assyrians had no idea Göbekli Tepe existed. It had been deliberately buried for 8 millennia before their city was founded, which leaves two cultures inventing the same silhouette independently, or a pattern that isn't really there at all. I genuinely don't know which of those I'd defend, but there's a third case, and it's the one that made me take the question seriously. La Venta, in the Mexican state of Tabasco. Olmec civilization, somewhere between 900 and 400 BCE. There's a carved stone slab there catalogued as Monument 19, showing a seated man with a large feathered serpent rearing up behind him. In his hand, resting against his leg, is a container. It has the same rounded body and the same rigid bar across the top. The Olmec had no contact with Assyria. There's no artifact, no plant, no disease, no genetic trace, nothing in the archaeological record that puts those two populations in the same conversation. The Atlantic, in 900 BCE, was not being crossed by anyone, and I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting it was. So look at what we actually have on the table. There's one carving in Turkey from around 9600 BCE, another in Iraq from around 865 BCE, and a third in Mexico from roughly the same century as the Iraqi one. The first is separated from the other two by more than 8,000 years, and those two are separated from each other by an ocean. Any explanation involving contact has to survive both of those gaps, and none of them do. I've read the attempts. Every one of them either invents a shipping route that left no evidence anywhere, or quietly stops mentioning Göbekli Tepe the moment the date becomes inconvenient. So contact is out, and when contact is out, most people reach straight for the other explanation, which is where this story usually goes badly wrong. I want to spend the next 2 minutes on a case that shows you exactly how it goes wrong, because it's the reason I almost didn't make this video. In 1976, a British author named Robert Temple published a book called The Serious Mystery. Its argument was that the Dogon people of Mali held astronomical knowledge they could not possibly have acquired on their own, specifically that Sirius has a companion star, invisible to the naked eye, orbiting it roughly every 50 years. Sirius B is real. It's a white dwarf. You cannot see it without a Sirius telescope, and Western astronomers only confirmed it in the 19th century. Temple's source was the French anthropologist Marcel Griaule, who worked among the Dogon in the 1930s and 40s and published his findings in 1948, and again with Germain Dieterlen in 1950. For decades, this sat near the top of every list of unexplained anomalies. I believed it myself, years before I started making any of these. Then, in 1991, an anthropologist named Walter van Beek published a restudy in the journal Current Anthropology. He'd been doing fieldwork among the Dogon since the 1970s. He and 8 colleagues went back to the same communities and asked directly, across multiple villages and multiple field seasons. Nobody outside Griaule's original circle of informants recognized the terms he'd recorded. And inside that circle, not one person described Sirius as a double star. The astronomical knowledge that had launched 50 years of speculation simply wasn't present in the population it had supposedly come from. Griol's daughter published a reply defending his methods, and the disagreement has never been formally closed, so I'll leave that door open. I'm not going to tell you Griol fabricated anything deliberately. What I suspect happened is more ordinary and more unsettling than fraud. A researcher arrived hoping to find a coherent cosmology, asked questions shaped by that hope, and a small number of people gave him something that fit the shape of the question. Now apply that mechanism to a carving on a rock and ask yourself how much of the pattern is in the stone and how much is in the looking. Here's where I landed, and it took me longer than I'd like to admit. There's an entire academic field working on this exact problem. It's called comparative mythology. And the accusation in this video's title isn't really true. People talk about this constantly. The reason it never reaches you is that what they've found doesn't compress into a thumbnail. A Russian folklorist named Yuri Berezkin has spent decades assembling a database of folklore motifs from cultures across the world, tagging each one by where it turns up. When you map the distributions, they don't scatter randomly. They cluster along the routes human populations actually took as they left Africa and spread across the continents. Certain story elements sit precisely where you'd expect them to sit if they had traveled inside people's heads. A French researcher, Julien Dewey, pushed that further by borrowing the tools evolutionary biologists use to build family trees out of DNA. Run the same mathematics over variants of a myth, and you get something that looks like descent. Stories that appear unrelated turn out to share an ancestor, and then there's the one that stopped me. In 2020, two astronomers, Ray and Barnaby Norris, published a paper about the Pleiades. That cluster is called the Seven Sisters in Greek tradition, in Aboriginal Australian tradition, and in a number of unconnected cultures. And in most of them, the story runs the same way. 7 young women pursued by a man associated with Orion. There's a second oddity sitting underneath it. Almost everybody says 7. Almost nobody sees 7. With good eyesight, you see 6. Their proposed answer is that the stars have moved. 2 of them, Pleione and Atlas, sat further apart in the past, far enough that the naked eye could resolve them separately. Run the proper motion backwards, and you arrive at a sky where 7 are visible. The date that produces is somewhere around 100,000 years ago, before most modern humans left Africa. If that's right, and it is a hypothesis, not a settled finding, and there are astronomers who don't buy it, then the reason 2 cultures on opposite sides of the planet tell the same story is that they aren't 2 cultures. It's one story told continuously in an unbroken chain of retellings across roughly 4,000 generations. That's the part I can't put down. I don't think anyone crossed the Atlantic. I think a container with a rigid handle is one of a very small number of ways to carry something in your hand, which means it gets invented over and over. And any 2 cultures that build one will end up building something that looks alike. That's the boring answer, and for the objects themselves, it's probably the correct one. But the Pleiades case covers something the boring answer doesn't. It tells us that human beings can carry a specific structure across 100,000 years with no writing, no contact, and nobody intending to preserve anything. And if that's possible for a story about 7 sisters, I don't know on what grounds we'd rule it out for a shape. That's the version I find harder to sleep on. Not that somebody visited us, that we've been handing things to each other for so long and so accidentally that we've lost track of which parts are ours and which parts we inherited. If this is the kind of thing you want more of, the most useful thing you can do is send it to the person you'd argue with about it. This channel grows through arguments, not algorithms. Because here's what I'm still stuck on, and I don't have an answer for it. If a story can survive 100,000 years by accident, and nobody along the way knows they're carrying it, what else made it through that we've stopped recognizing as old